Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Well, Nathan, one major storm has done unbelievable damage. And as of this recording right now, another catastrophic-looking storm is headed directly for Florida, Tampa region. So just saying that out loud to say that, yeah, we have occasion, as we always do, to be in prayer for people. I know that in my neck of the woods here in Georgia, a lot of people I know personally and around the state are opening their homes up for folks who are taking shelter from that storm. But it's sobering. It's sobering to watch. I saw one meteorologist actually choke up live during the news broadcast as he was describing the power of the storm, its trajectory. So timely, powerful reminders of human frailty and vulnerability. So yeah, wanted to say that. I mean, we're recording this right now. This is Wednesday, this recording, and I believe last I had checked, this is supposed to hit tonight at some point. So we're speaking now with very little knowledge of what actually is going to happen, how this is actually, but wanted to say a few words there. But today we want to talk about kids and reading, and specifically why kids really aren't reading anymore at all. Nathan, let me start on this note. There's a veritable cottage industry of books that have been coming out probably since maybe the late 70s, certainly through the 80s and 90s, decrying the state of literary culture. I've got several on my shelf, and they're all saying, well, reading, is something of the past. We're a dying breed. Those of us who love Jane Austen and Shakespeare, it's just not happening anymore, and nobody has that kind of sustained focus and attentiveness. And I'll confess, I've always kind of greeted it with a little bit of amusement. It seems a little self-indulgent to me. Some of these writers, most of whom are, who have written these books, are Ivy League educated, or they're invariably writing instructors, and they talk about the dwindling quality of their students, and then they basically just quote a whole lot of poetry to you and lots of great literature and prove how literate they are in these books. There's something that just feels self-congratulatory about it, and but for the first time now, I'm seeing these articles and the tone's different, and I'm taking them more seriously. So I came across an article, and I'll link to these in the show notes, but I'd come across an article in Slate magazine written by a professor. This did not have that self-congratulatory tone. It did not have that sort of, woe is me. It's hard to be as eloquent as I am in this, illiterate morass of this culture. What it sounded like was more, I am having serious difficulties as an instructor because my students can't read beyond 20 pages. If I assign more than, I think it was either 20 or 30 pages, if I assign more than that, they can't handle it anymore. They can't comprehend. They just can't do it. So this was written this was just sort of practically, and he said, and also anecdotally, people in other departments, other colleagues of mine, are facing the same dilemma. How do I teach material when my students aren't prepared to read? And then Nathan, you turned my attention to an article in the National Review. There was one in the Atlantic as well. But basically, these were talking about how even Ivy League schools are experiencing this. Students increasingly, it's not that they're unwilling to read for a long, large portions of a book or just a whole book. They don't seem to know how to do it. That's what caught me off guard.
Yeah, that's a little surprising on the how bit. I can see the focus, the attention span, or a lack of willingness, but say more of what you think is behind the how bit there.
Well, I'm not quite sure I'm even understanding what that. So you start at the beginning and go all the way through. It seems to be, well, it just seems to be the case that what's happening is they're running out of mental stamina. If I'm understanding this correctly. So, I mean, obviously there's the very straightforward how, start at the beginning, read through to the end. But it seems to be a question of, do I have the stamina to carry me through this? Another thought that caught me off guard was that reading is seen by some younger people. And let me just be clear. I'm not sure I buy all of this. I've been skeptical about this whole, we're growing increasingly illiterate thesis for a while. I'm more sympathetic now because I think the tone from these articles is different. These professors are speaking very much in practical terms. So, but yeah, the idea seems to be reading is now kind of, it's an antiquated practice. Some people like to continue collecting vinyl, and some people like kind of retro technology, and reading is in that same category for some young people, apparently. Here's why okay, so we can talk about some of the sociological factors that are absolutely contributing to that. But the truth of the matter is, Nathan, I get on airplanes, I go in public places, and I see young people reading all the time. Lots of young people.
Mm-hmm.
And I see them with actual physical books in their hands, not just Kindles, not just electronic readers. So there is part of me that, but nevertheless, I don't think that these professors are lying about their experience with their students. And not just professors, I mean, high school teachers. I know people, recreational reading is going down, but at the same time, book sales are fairly steady, and I do see a lot of people reading. So I don't know. That's a lot of me kind of just sort of stammering around here.
Yeah. Well, so let me give you some thoughts here that not contradict, but give some context too. So, not all reading is the same, obviously, but I'm talking about in terms of effort and duration. So there is reading that is written for entertainment, which does not demand that you actively, critically engage with any ideas. It's just page turner stuff. And I would say that when I'm looking at what I'm looking at other people reading in public spaces, it's got a dragon in it or something, and it's a fantasy novel, sure, page turner kind of, or romance stuff. Yeah, I mean, you can throw all your Michael Crichton, Tom Clancy, the whole John Grisham, kind of these mass popular page turner. And hey, I have no problem at all with reading fiction, and it's fun just to jump into a fiction book sometime and let it rip for a few hours. So I'm all for it. But I think that's a different kind of reading than engaging with an idea, writing notes in the margin, underlining to find the thesis and key points, putting in, writing in the margins places where you disagree or where it looks like there are contradictions to the argument. And so reading to parse things out and to critically engage with what's being written, I think is a totally different category than just reading. So is that so I was at a church, a couple years ago, and I talked to a guy who owned a Christian bookstore, and I made some joke about Amish romance novels, and he sighed deeply and hung his head, and he said, "I hate to admit it, but he's like, Amish romance is what keeps our doors open." So that's within the Christian world of saying the difference between reading an Amish romance and parsing out the finer nuances of Charles Taylor is the difference between going for a jog and racing a marathon. So both of those require you to put your running shoes on, but the duration and the exertion and the complexity of those events are very different. So I'm wondering if it's not helpful to make a distinction in type and style and content of reading. Because I certainly feel that in my own life, and I kind of break it down to this is long run reading, this is like sprint workout reading, maybe more like an essay where it's a shorter duration but a higher intensity, requires more attention and focus. There's stuff that I can read at 3:00 in the morning and make perfect sense of, and then there's stuff that I've got to be on my A game to be able to really work through and get the full meaning of it. I think there's also reading where I'm reading sentence to sentence, almost like speed reading, skimming. You're getting it. And then there's stuff where like I'm reading half a page and then staring at the wall or out the window for 45 seconds in between. Like I have to just, it's like chewing something that's really tough. Like it can be good, but you're just doing like intense, like you can get exhausted from reading like that. So I think that's all to say there's I think there's a wide range of what reading means. And I noticed that living in a very skimming culture where our eyes, lots of people have written about how we kind of read and Z's down pages and web pages and stuff. We're not really trained or encouraged to read every single word. We're more just like kind of mapping the meaning of a paragraph as we flash by. There has to be some correlation. I think, is it Nicholas who wrote The Shallows? That idea that our brains are being Nicholas Carr, in the ways that there has to be a way that our brains are shifting and shaping in the ways in which we're processing digital print. So I think there's something to it, and I'm just making a distinction and pointing out what I experienced in my own life. Of A, there's different levels of reading, and then B, there's a time factor in that too. Of here's a book that like is maybe 40% interesting to me, and if I can find like a lecture that the author did on the topic for about an hour, it's way easier for me to 2x that thing on YouTube, listen to that lecture and be like, yeah, I think I got the main gist of what they're trying to get out there, rather than to say, I'm going to sit down here and keep this by my nightstand and plug away at it and write notes in it until I've really wrapped my head fully around the argument. So that's my hypothesis. People are reading, but they're not reading
that makes sense.
To learn. They're reading to be entertained.
Right. So there's a quantity versus quality kind of dimension to this right now as well. Yeah. And regarding entertainment, I mean, there are different reading for entertainment. So there are perhaps some levels to that. So I would put, for instance, and I do think this is helpful to the conversation here. So I would put, Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park on a higher shelf than a piece of Amish romance.
Sure.
A piece of Amish romance is, I would say, narrow escapism. The Michael Crichton book is entertaining, but also it's a higher quality of writing and contains some interesting questions. But then above that would be something like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
I was going to say, I knew you were going there. I knew Dostoevsky was on his way. But because the point here that Cameron's making is it is narrative. It is a story. But if you're paying attention, you got to stop and be like, oh, whoa, hang on a minute, as you go along.
Yeah, and it's not so. If let's just pause on literature for a little while, because that's what you're going to encounter when you're in college, presumably. One hopes, if we follow a traditional model. Well, it's not just that Crime and Punishment is an intellectually challenging book. It is, but it's also an old book. And that requires work as well. You've got to adjust to the frequency of an older book. So Crime and Punishment is an example of a Russian novel, so that's translated. But even in the translation, the language is going to be different. The societal conventions are going to be different. So when you read, some people will bristle at this, sort of purists of the arts might bristle at this. But if you're reading an older novel, you're also getting a history lesson. This is why those older novels come with what some people think are those annoying introductions trying to give you context. But the truth is, you often do need context to make sense of Dostoevsky's Russia, for instance.
This is when you know you've become an adult, when you think the introduction to books are important. Like I can distinctly remember being assigned assignments in like middle school, and it's like, read this book, and we're all like, oh, do we have to read the introduction? Like how do we get out of it? And then there's like a flip gets switched, or a switch gets flipped in your mind at some point where like, actually the introduction is probably one of the most helpful parts of the entire book. So just to tag on to what you're saying there,
take a more recent book. Take a more recent American book. Imagine reading To Kill a Mockingbird with little to no historical knowledge whatsoever of race in America. Now, is the quality of the story strong enough to stand on its own? Yes, I think it is. would you miss out on to a significant degree on that book? Well, yeah, absolutely you would, because your understanding would be greatly, your appreciation would be greatly enriched by that vital piece of historical and cultural context.
Okay,
and
let me blindside you with something here.
That's true.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
So here's what I'm pitching to you, because so we say, the context is important to the book, but are there still works of literary art that are crucial to the context of understanding America? I mean, is that not the idea of the history of kind of the liberal arts education or the literature courses or whatever, of like, you basically need to know the core movements of these certain books in order to be able to catch the full meaning of the life that you're in, the culture you're seeing unfold around you? I mean, I get that for the last several decades and centuries, but is that still true? Is a question I would love to hear you. And are we in new water here?
Yes, it is. No, it's still true. We're less people, I would say, recognize the validity of that. So let me expand on that for just a second. A number of sociologists, everybody from Durkheim all the way up to James Davison Hunter and people like that, have said the poets of a particular culture play an instrumental role in shaping the way that culture not only thinks, but the way they imagine the world to be. Which is why, if you want, so let me give some specific examples with regard to the United States. Some of the foundational texts in America would be, well, one, the Bible. I mean, really, the Bible is a foundational text in America. But then other ones, though, that are key, and whether you've read them or not, they have played a role in how you think. One would be Emerson. He's a key American poet and sage. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, particularly his essay Self-Reliance, that is in America's DNA. Another one would be the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. I mean, that's an indelible part. Moby Dick, and also The Great Gatsby. And I would say Huckleberry Finn. These are
throw some Steinbeck in there.
American texts. Yes. With Steinbeck, probably, I think his greatest novel, you and I probably both agree on this one, it's East of Eden, Grapes of Wrath, certainly. He wrote so many, and he's an even more contemporary writer than the ones I've mentioned. But America is a relatively young country, so these are all fairly new authors that I've named. But these people are describing the imaginative landscape of America, for better or for worse.
Yeah, but hang on.
But this is true.
Hang on.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
So I want what you're saying to be true, but I'm trying to figure out why this doesn't seem true to me anymore. Okay, so let me run it from a couple different angles. One being that, somebody, you're talking about older writing, somebody pointed out that actually kids, young people going forward from this moment won't be able to read the Founding Fathers' original writings because they're written in cursive. And most people don't learn to read or write cursive anymore. So it's the same language. It's just presented in a style that will no longer be legible to the future. So that's fascinating. But then so I think we still have modern poets, but are those modern poets writing in written word, or are they is it not in film and in music and in so many other categories now
we're talking
that are not novels? So I'm saying
we're talking about two different things.
I think I'm hoping we are, but I'm not sure, because I think we can say Steinbeck or Emerson is descriptive of the past and where we've come from, but have we moved off of those foundations, I guess, is the question that take the last 10 years. Okay, you're going to strongly disagree. Make your point.
The past has never passed. No, past has never passed. No, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the money quote is always, history is an impertinence and an injury to me if it be anything less than a cheerful parable or apologue of my being and becoming. That
so why does somebody
perfectly
But why does somebody need
current
to
view of
read that?
identity. Do people know the
Why
quote?
does-
No. No, I'm not saying anybody has to read it, though. See, that's why I think we're saying two different things. I'm saying these people have predisposed the American mind to certain imaginative vistas that we're still seeing. It helps to go back and read them because then you can put a face to the thought. Now, will people do that? No. I think less and less people recognize the practical value of that. But so to my mind, there are two different questions here. The question of the poets who have kind of contributed to the DNA of our nation and in our those historical voices who are still singing today, whether we recognize it or not, and then the people who are adding to that tapestry now. And I would agree with you. I don't think they're novelists mainly. I think they are more people doing visual things, whether it's in film, but increasingly other mediums as well.
Well,
but
can I tell you
music,
why I think?
Yeah.
So this is why here's an important question though. Speaking Christianly here, is that I'm noticing the impact of this on personal Bible study and discipleship resources. So if you can't sit and read for 15 minutes and critically engage with the text, reading the Bible is going to be tricky for you. If and we're kind of past the thing of like where somebody's like, "Hey, I have a question about this," and they say, "Hey, here's a great book on this." You know, you can probably knock this thing out in 6 or 7 hours if you want to, an in-depth thought on that. That's becoming a harder and harder sell. So I think it is like it's a complex question, but I would say this has significant consequences for how we do church and discipleship and our own personal study and growth. So I'm trying to take a massive leap forward here and bring it home a little more for us.
Sustained, careful attention is a choice. The other ways that we consume information now, scrolling, all of that, is not.
Say more.
I think that, yes. So if you don't make the choice to exercise your muscles of sustained attention, reading long form things, novels, and all of that, full books, or just lengthy periods of time where you're reading, or set aside chunks of time for reading. If you don't make that choice, it won't happen. But the other ways of consuming information are the ways that we just simply drift into. Those are the ways, and they're so easy. Scrolling, all of that, it's we've talked before ad nauseum about how this is all geared to be maximally addicting. But it's just so unbelievably easy in a way that's not dissimilar to a bag of Skittles. Is it highly nutritious? No, but it's so easy. It tastes good, goes down so easily. And so many of our recreational habits, so many of our study habits really resemble munching on Skittles rather than,
good analogy,
dare I say it, eating your broccoli, which is not a very fetching analogy, but there are things that we can do that we know have long-term benefits and are good for us in the long run. It's not just about nutrition. You can put all sorts of different practices in here, whether you're, saving money or whether you're exercising, whatever it is. There's a growing recognition of the tremendous power that comes with discipline. And I really do want to emphasize that word power, the power of virtue. Now, sadly, I think this growing recognition is sometimes relatively superficial, but it is a start. In gyms, for instance, there's a big push now against the whole, this sounds almost like Ben Shapiro in a gym, against following your feelings. Because let's face it, if you follow your feelings, you'll never exercise the way you ought to. You never eat the way you ought to. But there's a recognition that, wow, if I do what I say, what I intend to do, and if I actually bring my body under my control, if I buffet the body and make it my slave, as St. Paul tells us, wow, there's a real power that comes with that. But again, this requires planning and it requires intentionality. To the other way of living, where you're basically just passively consuming not just information, but everything that's packaged more and more as entertainment to you. If you're just passively consuming whatever comes your way, that's the easier thing to do. And you can just drift into that. And it does have long-term consequences for our mental development. I mean, if neuroplasticity is a real thing, and it is, well, what's it doing to you mentally if you're just constantly feeding addictive behaviors and just scrolling through news? Well, not news, but just the items on your phone, reading a little bit here, reading a little bit there, clicking on a hyperlink there.
Okay. Hang on, Cameron. How many times in the last 5 years have you been invited to speak someplace that 10 years ago they would have said, hey, can you give a 45-minute presentation, do Q&A? That would now say, could you do something more like kind of like a 15-minute TED Talk kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Does that resonate in your speaking engagements in the world?
Of course.
Why is that?
Of course, yes. Yeah, but see, that's convicting, because that's a picture of how this mindset is infiltrating our ministry circles and the church. And this is why this is a whole separate conversation, but we should have this one soon. But if you look at some of the people who have written really well about the early church, they increasingly are saying things along. I mean, this is everybody from NT Wright to the man who wrote the Spirit of the Early Church. I think that's Robert Louis Wilkin. They talk about how the focus wasn't on engaging the culture by meeting it on its own terms. The focus was very much on pressing into what it means to be a Christian, drawing on the resources and the wealth of our church, of the church, and becoming Christ-like ourselves. And then
massive focus on habitus, there will be informing habits and full-bodied interaction with ideas.
Right. So we cultivate, in other words, the church cultivates its own. We have our own culture, and it's not. So we want to. There's a balance here. We want to pay attention to what's going on around us. We want to know what the questions are around us, what the needs are. But our anchor, though, is in Christ, His people, and His Word, and that ought to ground us. And so the church ought to be the place where we recognize the importance of study and sustained attention. No, we're not saying everybody's a nerd and a college professor, but we are. I mean, we weren't called the people of the book for no reason. That was originally a pejorative insult. But we are people of the Word, and we recognize the importance of sustained attention, and we also recognize the detriments of nonstop titillation all the time. We're not the human beings, the mind. We're not made for that, and so we need to hold on to our own traditions here.
Okay, well let's talk about some practical things here, because I bet that every single person listening to this has recognized in the last 5 years their attentive ability to just I remember when I was in my mid-20s one time needing to read a book, and I went to a park and read a 600-page book in one sitting. I don't think I could pull that off anymore. Mm-hmm. So I feel this in myself, and I think screen habits are definitely a part of that. The ease in which it is to kind of let information wash over you on YouTube or whatever other thing you're scrolling on,
and people also being able to reach you all the time and interrupt you all the time with the phone.
Constantly
you're walking around,
throw a couple kids in there and a chicken or two, and there you go. Mm-hmm. Recipe for a distraction. So the challenge there are real, and I think what I would like to hear you help me with is because you could approach this in two ways and say, hey, the times they are changing, we're going to move to different formats. Let's try to make so why is this? There's concern in your voice and in you picking this topic of thinking hey, this doesn't bode well for us in the future. Yeah. Make the pitch of saying, let's say that I weighed 700 pounds and you came to me as a friend and said, Nathan, this is not healthy for you. Here's some things you could do moving forward. Give me your vision of why this is important and some of the steps that I could take to be able to concentrate on my or develop habits of reading that are really, really valuable for my character, for my community, and for my church participation.
It's not dissimilar from the example you just gave. Your quality of life will go up. But it won't, but again, it will require work and it will require sacrifice. But when it comes to, so if in the realm of exercising and all of that, your quality of life will go up because you'll feel physically better. You will feel mentally better. How? Your mental flexibility and agility will be enhanced. Your ability to focus will be enhanced. Your vision of the richness of life will be deepened. Your ability to be alone with yourself and not be bored will be enhanced. I think that's a huge piece. The head of humanities at the University of Chicago once said that. He said it much more eloquently. I can't remember his precise turn of phrase, and I've been hunting for a long time to try to find this again. But he said something to the effect of, we're trying to cultivate students for whom basically solitude is not a boring thing. They will have what's in their head is interesting. And reading will do that. It'll add complexity to the world. Yes, it will. I'm trying to avoid some of the typical language that's used nowadays, which I think we're just kind of over familiarity has deadened us to it. It'll enhance your empathy. Well, what that means though, is it will open your eyes to different ways of looking at the world, which is tremendously exciting. There are more ways of seeing this world, and it's also kind of dangerous. Yes, it is. There are very captivating foreign ways of looking at the world, some of which aren't true, but it will also help you to love your neighbor more effectively. Eugene Peterson used to say that they should teach literature at seminaries, because great literature, great stories are all about human experience, and that will greatly enhance the work of pastors as they deal with their congregations. Fair, let me just say a few words about. Yes, go ahead.
Well, let me say, like when I was at Gordon Conwell in pastoral ministry classes, there was reading on the side that was Lee Finger's Peace Like a River or Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. Or there, I think seminaries are waking up to this. That there's like,
good.
Okay, finish your thought, but then let's say something about fiction, because I just mentioned 2 fictional books, and you say, how does that have anything to do with human experience? Finish your thought, and let's come back to the value of fiction and all of this.
Well, just a word on why this is so hard. It's not just yes, we can harp on about technology and smartphones and all that, but it's more than that. So here's part of what I feel. There is an unvoiced but very real disapproval about just sitting around and reading a book. I feel it in my own life. I feel this. This is what I didn't have before, Nathan. And I suspect you didn't have it before either when you read a 600-page book in one sitting. This urgent kind of this gnawing anxiety. There's something else I should be doing. Something that's better than this. I should be doing something productive. I need to be taking care of something. I need to be cleaning something. I need to be sending an email. I need to be getting this proposal in. Whatever it is I need to do. There's something else. This is not productive. I am wasting time. So, yes, are there priorities? Of course. Are there items on our to-do list that we have to check off? Of course. I'm not saying that you shirk responsibility, but I'm saying that that's the tyranny of the urgent in practical terms. That's a scourge. And that's one of those things that really hurts reading culture. Because when you are reading, when you are thinking well, when you are giving your sustained attention and focus to something that's worthy of that attention, you are not wasting time. What you're doing is very spiritually rewarding. And so it doesn't cash out in the same kind of quantitative terms that our world right now values. You see, we forget our culture is thoroughly atheistic in this sense. There's an interesting point that Hunter makes in his latest book, Democracy and Solidarity, and he's just drawing on Durkheim, Emile Durkheim, famous sociologist, but he points out that culture takes on a kind of life of its own, independent of the population. And one of the ways he proves that is he says, look, in America, a huge amount of people believe in God. A huge amount of people go to church, it's still, very large amounts of people. And yet the overwhelming direction of the culture is secular. It's thoroughly atheistic. the idea that the only thing that really counts is materialistic reality. There's nothing else that's really real. Well, that a lot of Christians have bought into that without realizing it. They just, in their day-to-day lives, they affirm that. They think that the only stuff that counts as real is what you can quantify and what you can control, rather than, they don't think about spiritual benefits as being truly practically helpful to you. So it's pushing. So in other words, it's an uphill battle, and the need to be reflective has never been more important. I think of a kind of a personal hero of mine is a guy named Ken Myers. Nathan, you may be familiar with him. He's the guy who does the Mars Hill Audio Journal.
Mm-hmm.
Mars Hill Audio started in 1992, and he's, in some ways, I don't want to flatter us too much. Part of what I think that we're doing at Thinking Out Loud is carrying on the spirit of Ken Myers' kind of work here. But he would conduct interviews, but with lots of Christian voices, and they didn't always settle on direct answers. It was more about the conversation and the thinking that went into it and being reflective. But he talked about when he first began doing this, he worked at NPR before he was an editor for Morning Edition before he ventured off and did Mars Hill Audio. He had such a hard time getting people to invest in Mars Hill Audio to support it, because nobody would recognize the value of something that was dedicated to reflection and analysis rather than activism.
Interesting.
Again, and I'm not saying activism is necessarily always atheistic, but I'm saying, the notion you got to be doing. What are the answers? What are the tangible, concrete deliverables that you're giving? Rather than, but we also need people thinking carefully and being reflective and thinking well and carefully about what's going on and the questions of our age. That carries tremendous values, and for that you need serious readers to do that. And not everybody is going to be a major serious reader. I don't think everybody needs to be one, but I think the people, especially who listen to this podcast,
but you better know a
category. Couple. And I'm just saying, as a word of, yes, right. You better know a couple, and a word of encouragement. It's an uphill battle, but it's a worthwhile battle. And the more you implement practices in your life where you can build that kind of sustained attention, the more power you'll find in that. So, yeah.
So there's a discernment element there too, right?
Off my soapbox.
But there's a discernment there in there too, I think, about deciding what to read. So eating Skittles for 6 hours is not admirable. Yep. So yeah, I think being thoughtful there is worthwhile in what you want to start in on and what you want to give up on that you're partway through and say, this is not going to help anything. But I was coming back to this verse in 1 Timothy 4:8, which is often quoted that, physical training is of some value. I'm looking at a NASB here. It says, for bodily discipline is only of little profit. But you hear that quoted, but the second half of that is, but godliness is profitable for all things, since it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. So the idea of physical training versus spiritual training, as other translations have it.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he points that out, that it is profitable for this present life and for the age to come. That really wherever you're starting from is not a fixed condition. I think that's one of the interesting things about kind of a Christian concept of education and habitus. And I think Christians were on the neuroplasticity way before, scientifically, we're saying you can actually be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That was yep. way back. Therefore, set your mind on things above. That what we choose to focus on changes not only our thought patterns, but actually our entire habits in life and response and character and virtue and all that. So I scroll, I use YouTube. I love it. It's great for finding information. But if you're wanting to grow in wisdom and understanding,
yep.
It's hard for me to beat that, find a way to do that other than in a good book. And there are books that I read, ebook versions that I don't think I'll ever come back to. But if it's a book that I'm going to come back to and I want to make notes in and I want to really think about it, it's hard to beat a good old paper in your hand with a pen or pencil book and work through something.
Mm-hmm.
Make notes, come up with your own little system. I think most of the books I have, I kind of have a system that, if there's a book on my shelf and I were to pick it up, probably in about 20 minutes, I could, if I hadn't looked at it for 5 years, I could get the gist of it in about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, just going back through and looking at my kind of stars, underline, little dash, asterisk system of being able to go back and review things, I find to be really, really helpful. So I think, I was trying to remember what the order of monks were who were only allowed one book a year. Does that ring a bell for you, Cameron?
Yeah.
There was a group where you got
Yes.
one book for the year and you just wallowed in that thing for 52 weeks and then off to the next one. Say something about because I'm thinking about the volume that you and I read. I got up at 3:30 this morning and read for 2 hours. I mean, so you and I are atypical probably in sponsoring publishers, but what's the value of going really slow with one thing and kind of leaning on that for a year or so?
Well, I've been saying this for a long time. I mean, if you want to think well, you have to slow down. And again, part of that culture I was talking about that militates against reading has to do also with speed and velocity. And it's all quantity over quality. And so that's why sometimes I'm sensitive to the, I listen to as many books as I can as well. And I ramp up the speed so I can get, which is fine. There are some practical considerations there. But if the idea is that you're going to cram as much information into your head as possible, the human mind doesn't work like that. We're not computers. And especially if it's something very rich, W.H. Auden was very wise on this. And he talked about how a masterpiece, for instance, let's say a great literary masterpiece, like, okay, the Divine Comedy, right? He'd say that should be reserved for what he called high holidays of the spirit.
I would say,
he said, you don't want to read
here.
So. That's right. And plenty of other people have said that. But and that's which is why they never make it to heaven, right? The paradiso. But part of what he's saying is, though, you don't want to read like that all the time. He compared that would be like eating an 11-course French meal every single night or something like that. Those are special occasions. So that's part of the discernment process as well. You think about, there are different kinds of books and there are different levels of reading. So when there's a really great masterpiece and it demands your full attention, whatever that piece is, that's the way you can look at it as well. When can you give it serious consideration? But also you need a balance in there. It's okay for, to have some fun reading in there. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but you want a balanced diet. But also, you'd asked me about the value of fiction, and I'll just put in one plug there real quickly. And there are so many things that could be said, but one is that fiction, unlike a work of philosophy, for instance, can't deal in pure abstractions. It has to be concrete, because if it's a good work of fiction, it's going to give you real characters with complex psychology. So part of what makes Dostoevsky such an easy example to give here, because you can talk about an idea like nihilism and write about it in an abstract sense. You can even look at it very vividly explored in Nietzsche, but it's another thing to read Dostoevsky's The Possessed or The Devils. It's got a couple of different translations, but his novel of political nihilism, and to read and to encounter those characters who put that into, embody it in flesh and blood, and it's just so much more vivid and so much more powerful. Fiction does that. Great fiction does that. It will give you all of these different ideas, but in real life scenarios, in concrete situations, and it adds. It's more vivid. It's more powerful.
It can also let you run ideas to their logical conclusion, most of which you'll want to end up avoiding.
Right.
I can't think of the poet who said that good poetry gives you real toads in imaginary gardens. I love that line. So it's an imaginary world, but it's painting a picture of a real toad for you. So the same thing happens with like the way that humans actually work is really deeply revealed in, Tolstoy or something. So there's that, and that's true. This is getting long, so let me turn the page just quickly here. I think, Cameron, the way that so let's say that you love reading and you want to pass that on to the next generation in your household or your circle of friends or something. Cameron, why? I want to hear what you say on this. Why do you think you love reading? So set aside personality and let's talk culturally here.
Well, I love reading because I had it modeled for me beautifully in
There
my
you go.
home, which is something that I know not everybody has. Yeah, so I grew up. I think Nathan, I think your experience is probably similar to mine. I grew up in a home filled with books, and also where books were deeply valued by both of my parents. My dad has always been an avid reader, especially history and sociology, and so it was a house surrounded by books. And also those books led to lots of vibrant discussions. So I think those were the two cornerstones, the veneration of books that was in my home and the rich discussions that followed from them. And this is true of even when I was a teenager and I wasn't interested in reading at all, I was still enjoying the ambiance of those books that they created in my home, and then eventually came to appreciate them. So I come from that's part of. So there was a legacy of reading in my house, which I know not everybody has. I'm guessing that was similar for you, Nathan.
Same, yeah. The availability of books was and that they were seen as something that adults took seriously. Now, I had some fun. Like, one of my reading achievements was I read the entire Hardy Boys series during class in fourth grade. In between stuff, say something about my public education there. But the other thing that matched in that is I was given books from both of my grandparents and my parents on every birthday and Christmas. So I always got a tool and a book from each of my grandparents and my parents. So I think giving books as a gift was one of the ways in which that was also shown as a value statement also in the family that I grew up in. So yeah, there's wild studies out there. You can I don't know the percent, like the idea that you can know whether or not a child will graduate from college based off of the number of books in their room when they're 6 years old, or there are all sorts of crazy correlations there. Kids that have had 1,000 books read to them before they get to kindergarten have, all kinds of exponentially different outcomes in life compared to the alternative there. And so I think if you love reading, one of the greatest gifts you can give is to read to the little people around you, to show the value of good books, to help people find good books, to recommend good books, to share, it's kind of like there's no such thing as a crazy cat lady who only has one cat. If you start to love books, one good book will lead to many more good books. And there's kind of a chain reaction that starts happening there, where one good book sparks your curiosity and interest about something else, and it kind of snowballs from there. The other thing to think about is, like, do you have a book budget for yourself annually, or does your family have a book budget? Or, so my wife and I, we have a much cheaper cell phone plan and allow ourselves books as part of the distance in between, not having high top of the line smartphones and all the services and subscriptions that go with that, and the freedom to enjoy a lot of books. We love our local library. Huge plug and shout out to all library lovers out there. We live in a time of phenomenal access to so many great things that it'd be a shame if we didn't take advantage of that and grow and learn from it. So I think we could do this for another hour, Cameron, talking about reading and the value of it and the importance of it. And hopefully some of the service that we provide at Thinking Out Loud and for those of you who financially support the work that we're doing, we recognize the privilege that it is that you guys are essentially buying time for us to read, and to take those ideas and to consolidate them, and then to repackage them in ways that are useful for college students and churches and retreats and conferences. And sometimes we even quote from books on this podcast. And so that really is a phenomenal privilege that we have. And I can say a heartfelt thank you to those of you who support the work that we're doing here in a financial way, because you're allowing us to have the time to do some of this that we otherwise wouldn't have. So just want to throw that in there as a thanks at the end of this. I'm sure we're going to come back to talking about reading. Kind of feels like we talk about reading in every single podcast, but it's good to focus on thinking about what are the roles, what are the skills that we can help other people develop? Where do we need to grow? Where can this be a little bit of a wake-up call to you to say, hey, get your head out of the algorithm and get your nose back in a book from time to time, for the good of the kingdom of God. It's not wasting time for you to be growing in character and mental acuity and astuteness. So see it as an act of worship. That's totally in bounds. So much more we can say there, but we better wrap it up. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope and reference a lot of books.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.